Hello and welcome, Exiles. Today I want to talk about my game plan for my start character, which is going to be a Stormweaver Archmage. I previously made a video going over some of the theory on it, and right now we just got a lot more concrete data, and I want to break down the things that excite me the most about it. On stream, if you're curious about my thoughts on other ascendancies, I'll be doing a deep dive in case you wonder about that, but I'm not going to make a separate video about it. I think there's already like 6 or 7 people that have made a video basically reading off the nodes, so let's just talk about Stormweaver specifically and why I'm excited about it. Now, initially, when they showcased the PoE2 content reveal, this specific scene here was very, very important to me. This strongbox scene here was important for 2 reasons. Number 1 is it showed the permanent Arcane Surge. You notice the character here has Arcane Surge. There's no duration on it. It is a permanent buff. And number 2 is when they click the box,
there are different types of
and they start to cast. Sorry, I'll mute it. So sorry, Mark. But when you start to cast, you'll notice, look at the mana bar. Look at the mana bar when they start to cast skills. This is something very, very important to me as somebody who's liked making mana builds in the past. And the important thing is the mana regen, the rate at which their mana is going up, is very, very high. And we know now why that is. It's because of what Arcane Surge does. Arcane Surge grants 10% more cast speed and 20% more mana regen per second. It's an outright multiplier. And the important thing here is this node, which gives you permanent Arcane Surge, is followed up by one of probably the strongest, one of the strongest nodes in the entire list of ascendancies, which is Arcane Surge effect per 15 mana. What that means is as you scale up your mana build, you get more and more benefit. For example, a 3k mana build no longer gets 10% more cast speed, they get 30% more cast speed. They no longer get 20% more mana regen, they get 60% more mana regen. I believe mana builds on the high end, pretty well optimized, will probably get to 4k plus mana. If there's more uniques or more ways to get percent mana than what we've seen on the tree, so far I've seen about 33% increased mana on the tree. If that number starts to go drastically up, so does the amount of mana you can end up getting, which makes this node just become more and more powerful the more you push into it. And the good news about that is it makes it a real scenario where you get to click Mind Over Matter. Mind Over Matter's big downside is it is 50% less mana recovery rate. If you have the ability to scale up to like 50% mana regen, you click this node and you still have 25% of your mana per second, that's still a really, really big deal. If you've been looking at any of the teasers of any of the passive tree, you've probably come away with the conclusion that life sustain and resource sustain in general is just scarcer. There's less regen, percent regen I'm seeing on the tree, there's not a ton of it. Leech seems a lot more awkward than it did in PoE 1 in terms of like you need a base percentage, and then there's a bunch of nodes you need to scale up to get the Leech to be decent. So I'm a little bit questionable on Leech. Even things like Recoup seems fairly scarce. There's, for example, I don't even know if this node is real, but it's 15% Fizz Recoup. It's specific and it's only to Fizz. Like, there's way more limitations there. This node over here says 6% Recoup, and Recoup takes course over 8 seconds instead of 4. So a lot of the sources of sustain I'm seeing for life builds are way more limited. For ES builds, you no longer have Ghost Reaver, so you can't get ES Leech naturally without like some other weird source like an ascendancy like the Chonk, for example. There's also Zealot's Oath, which got changed, which means your base percent regen nodes you do click on the tree that would apply to life no longer work to apply to ES. You have to scale life to then make it the regen of your life then go on the overcap to your ES. So there's some weird stuff where they're limiting scaling a lot more in terms of how much you can sustain per second. And what I'm seeing on Stormweaver and how much mana sustain you can get, and the fact that the new base percentage for mana regen is 4% based on Dreamcore's video, regen for mana can be actually fairly legit. I definitely could see a world where you get up to 50% plus mana per second, and then you can click Mind Over Matter and get 25% per second, which is still crazy mana regen. Like, considering you have, let's say, a 4k mana pool, 1k mana per second is very, very strong sustain. And so the idea would be we would click Chaos Inoculation, Mind Over Matter, and what that would mean is we could have a big ES pool where, let's say, we have 10k, 15k ES. These are all realistic numbers. I think even more so than I said before. If you know my previous video, there was a key piece I was missing. They actually introduced a rune called the Iron Rune, which gives local percent ES up to 20%. So what ends up happening is my estimates for 2 to 3k flat from your gear, that estimate instantly goes up to somewhere closer to 2,500 to 4k even, I would say, flat you could get from your gear, which means the end game ES numbers, I think there's a good chance we might see 15 to 20k ES on the early access, unless they nerf it really early on before somebody crafts some good gear. But the point is, we'd have this big ES barrier, and then by the time the enemy gets through this big ES barrier, we have another 4k mana that's regenning at 1k per second they have to go through. Most life builds are going to have a hard time getting to 4k life, and that's just our backup defense. The enemy has to get through our 10k ES first to then get to our mana. So it should be very, very strong in terms of just raw EHP and overall tank in terms of max hit, stuff like that. But not only that, I highlighted the 8 and 9 node first because I was really excited about. We also get the access to something that most builds don't have, which is a way to sustain ES outside of recharge, which is elemental damage taken recouped as energy shield. Now, recoup taking 8 seconds is a fairly big nerf, and I was unsure about this. I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but I'm still coming away with the conclusion that over the duration of 8 seconds, you're getting almost half the damage you've taken back. That's a pretty big deal, especially considering like they chip you down, they finally get to your mana pool, and you have this mana pool that's resistant because it keeps regenning, but then all that damage they did to you over however many seconds to get your ES depleted, you have this built-up recoup that is also proccing and resisting the damage that's incoming to try to finish you off. I think it's going to end up being very, very tanky because of this. So right now, just looking at these trees, I think it's pretty no-brainer that Arcane Surge Effect, and the Recoup nodes are just going to feel fantastic with the CI combined with a big Mind Over Matter pool. I think it's going to feel really, really good. Outside of that, the other nodes, there's some good things here, but it's hard for me to justify giving up any of these other nodes. I can see a world where maybe I can give up Heart of the Storm sometimes, but Arcane Surge, I think, is it's just too strong to ignore. I believe the scaling with Arcane Surge that they showed with the spell gain is extra is just something that you can't ignore, and thus, because of that, it's really hard to justify not going the thing that allows you, that unlocks the ability to sustain mana at a very efficient rate. Because Arcane Surge isn't easy to proc. The Arcane Surge support requires you to spend 100% of your total mana pool with a given support. So it's not like this is an easy buff to generate. So this permanent node is quite relevant. And then the fact you can scale up its effect to the moon as you get a better and better character just ends up being quite solid. I mean, if you're getting to 4,500 mana, that is alone making you have 40% more cast speed, which means these Ascendancy nodes are 20% more damage, 20% more damage, on top of the fact they're giving you, all that sustain. But anyways, moving on to the other nodes. Scouring Winds, this is just a good DPS node. I think it's not as strong as 20% more damage, because generally I think the play is going to be going conductivity plus exposure, and I believe exposure is base 30, and what we've seen of res curses, it looks like res curses are going to be anywhere from 30 to 40. Bosses could be anywhere from, let's say, 30 to 75 resistance. So most of the time, you'll probably take them to below 0, in which case Scouring Winds will be just a little bit less damage than 20% more, but it's still a solid damage option. Similar to the Shock node, which can give you double shocks. I think it's just going to be a math equation of how much increased damage taking sources do we have versus how much res minus do we have. But I think these are probably your top picks for your 4th node. You can go full DPS. Outside of that, depending on how much you can get crit, Elemental Storm, just having another thing proc like this could be a larger DPS upgrade, just depending on how effective this skill really is in game. We don't have a lot of information here based on what they told us here. It could be good. It could be even worth dropping the recoup to go all in to have it proc even more often, but it's just an I don't know situation. I'm a little bit concerned about sources of crit. From what I've seen, there's very few sources of increased crit chance to scale your crit. You can get a good base crit. A lot of cold skills have from 10 to 13 base crit. You can get Eye of Winter and Inflict Critical Weakness, which gives you another 10 base crit. And starting with 20 base crit is huge, but percent increased crit chance, I just have seen very little of it. I've seen 10%, 15% on a notable, and only a couple different times. So I'm a little bit concerned that getting crit chance is going to be rough. Crit damage or crit multi-scaling seems better than it is in PoE2, but they're leveraging that behind making it harder to crit in general. Outside of that, the nodes that I don't think are very good are the nodes that give you the all damage can inflict. I just think these are typically not really necessary. If you're leaning into Archmage, if you're leaning into Arcane Surge, you're going to have gain 100, gain 200% mana as extra lightning. So your skills are going to deal a lot of lightning anyway, so you'll shock regardless. So Shaper Storms, I have a hard time seeing the value in unless you're doing something kind of weird in terms of how you're setting up your character and you're not going Archmage, for example. And then as for Shaper of Winter, this has a little bit more chance, but it's really contingent on how valuable Heavy Snows is. I need to look more into how the chill mechanics work. This one is something that's quasi tempting to me because if I end up wanting to run temp chains and then I include a double chill on top of that, it's something where we could make the boss incredibly slow and just have very high uptime DPS and we don't have to dodge very much. That may be an option, but I need to look more into how effective this chill node would be. And at the end of it, I'm still not really sure it's necessary. I'd rather just increase my damage and rather just PK or rather just take out the enemy. I don't want to. I always like to say this, a dead enemy is better than a frozen enemy or a chilled enemy or a slowed enemy. I think damage is king at the end of it all. And I think that means I'm leaning towards the double shock or the exposure node as the final node after we do Heart of the Storm for the recoup and the Arcane Surge node. So that's my takeaway on this Ascendancy. The cast on crit skill could be good, kind of up in the air. But outside of that, I'm leaning heavily towards the recoup and the Arcane Surge. I just think it will be incredible in terms of sustain and ultimately will allow us to have a pretty good raw EHP pool, which also just means raw tank. And there's not a lot of other Ascendancies that have this access point to tank not quite as well as from what I've seen. There's a few that kind of stick out that have some potential in terms of scaling some pretty good tank. But, you know, out of 12 Ascendancies, there's maybe 3 Ascendancies that have some decent tank options, and I think Stormweaver, honestly, with this recoup node and the Arcane Surge effect, I think this is going to be number 1. We will see. Okay, now, that is the breakdown of the Ascendancy of what I like about it. Just to going to talk a little bit about the game plan for those curious that wanted to copy what I'm doing. I'm going to stream this all live, so it'll be on YouTube and Twitch. If you're curious about following along with what I do on League Star, ultimately, you know, League Star is going to be all over the place. But my initial plan essentially is going to be % damage nodes all the way up to here. This wheel, by the way, these trees that people have posted, they're a hodgepodge of people adding data from like old playtests that are just incorrect. I'll give you an example real quick. This node right here says 25% mana. Dreamcore's video based on his playtest in November 8th said there's only like 3 or 4% mana nodes. And you have to compare it with other notables on the tree, and like it just doesn't make sense, right? This Mana Blessing, which is a node we for sure saw from the November 8 playtest, is 6% mana, 20 flat. There's no way 25% mana is on there as well. Like these notable, it wouldn't make sense to have a notable that has 25% mana versus a notable that has 6% mana. I'm pretty sure some of these things are just outdated. Same thing with like the small node over here said 8% mana. So take this tree with a grain of salt. But anyways, the initial plan is going to be % damage, and then I'm ultimately thinking of the Sork Wheel starts with basically a fire, lightning, and cold option here. I'm thinking initially fire spells early are going to be good, like Fireball, Solar Orb. I was looking at some of the skills. These skills just seem like they'd be chill to play initially. Firestorm, stuff like that. A combination of those skills is what I'd like to start out with, and then I'll probably want to swap to Ball Lightning later. I believe Ball Lightning is a higher level skill. It says it's tier 11. This stuff is probably ultimately going to change, but in my mind, what that means is it's probably a skill that's maybe unlocked at level 30 or 40 or who knows. So I don't want to plan on starting out with Ball Lightning initially. I think the fire skills will be solid to begin with. We're not going to start out with Archmage because Archmage initially you don't have the sustain for or the mana to benefit from the damage. It's one of those things where I think we're going to get our first levels done. We're going to start out with fire skills. We'll probably go over to get some mana regen, maybe get some early ES nodes, and then start gunning our way up here through the center of the tree, looking towards either these generic elemental damage nodes or some of these early fire nodes over here if they're good. We just don't really know too much of what they do. Like this one says it has explode. I don't know if that's a new node or if that's actually what it does. But the point is, start out with some generic fire damage caster stuff. I think those skills look pretty solid for the early game. Prioritize getting a weapon early. The biggest mistake I've seen from people leveling is they don't upgrade their weapon. If you've seen a playtest from these playtests and you see they're doing no damage, it's almost 100% of the time they have the weapon they literally dropped from like the bloated Miller. Unless they're subtracting and they dropped a good weapon, they probably dropped a bad weapon and they just haven't upgraded it. I would say regularly, every single time you level, check the caster vendor, look at the wands and staves and look for plus levels and % damage. Ultimately, if you drop a +2 lightning, % lightning damage staff, forget everything I'm saying about fire spells, grab a lightning spell, it'll probably do better. Ultimately, that weapon matters a lot. And it's just a matter of respecking a couple nodes, whether or not you're fire prioritized or lightning prioritized. But I'd say prioritize whatever weapon you find that has good % damage scaling. I'm thinking fire is what I'm going to shoot for. I'm going to check the vendor. Hopefully I find fire. If I find a plus level lightning, I'm not going to question it because ultimately respecking is not too hard with gold. But anyways, after prioritizing getting the early levels done for, let's say, fire skills, and we have some of the early elemental damage, once we start looking at level 25, that's around when we get the access to the lab. That's when you start considering these nodes: pure power, damage per mana, percent mana. The arcane surge node that is in the first lab is what I'm going to do, the one that gives you 10% more mana and more cast speed. And that's when I'm going to start transitioning into saying, okay, let me start getting lightning skills. Let me start looking at getting Archmage. And okay, one thing I'll say about the Archmage real quick, it's 100% spirit. So initially you don't have that. You get throughout the campaign 180 spirit, 30 spirit per act. Archmage is something you'll have to hold off on just because you don't have the 30 spirit. Initially, you go Whispers of Doom and you do, let's say, Flammability plus Enfeeble, or once you swap over to Lightning, go Conductivity plus Enfeeble. Basically, I'm going to say Defense Curse plus Damage Curse, and I'm going to stick till that until, honestly, I'm going to recommend going probably Triple Curse and do Temp Chains, Conductivity, Enfeeble. Curses just are completely busted. I said this in the last video I did 5 days ago. They're very, very strong. I think there's scenarios where you can scale aura effect with nodes like this. These nodes that used to say aura effect on PoE1, they all say non-curse auras. This says 20% aura effect. It doesn't say non-curse. This will work with Blasphemy, or it should mechanically. So I think there's some strong indications for scaling here. But yeah, anyways, as I was saying, initial damage nodes, gunning it straight up here, damage nodes, and then Whispers of Doom, arcane intensity, raw mana, pure power. Start building into the stuff that we want to go into eventually, which is lightning skill. And I think from that point on, it's basically just grabbing the obvious nodes of lightning damage, mana, ES, where it is on the tree. Like, there's a good wheel here for ES. There's a decent wheel here for ES. There's a good wheel here for ES mana. Keep your eyes open for those sorts of things. And I will be doing daily uploads or daily updates to the character as I go, or you can watch me on stream as I do the progression through the PoE2 campaign, but that's my general plan. I'm not going to overthink the tree because all this stuff is very subject to change. A lot of it's outdated, but that's the general game plan. Prioritize the decent skills early on. Like, I think the early fire skills, Solar Orb, Fireball, they seem pretty strong. Or if you get a good weapon, don't ignore the fact what RNG is giving you. You could also try to like sell it and then buy a plus fire weapon or something like that, but I don't know. I think it's probably just gonna be faster if you get a +2 cold, run with it, make use of it. But yeah, anyways, that's the general game plan. I will say this one thing I also want to add to this is, from what I can tell, I think these pen nodes, they're gonna be solid early on. So it's maybe something you spec early, but eventually I would spec out of it because mechanically there's this new thing where penetration you can only pen to 0. You can't pen past 0, which means it's just better late game to scale into exposure, res curse, whatever you can do to make the enemy's resistance go higher into the negatives is going to give you damage, and then pen on top of that will do nothing. Early game, I think it's solid to go into some of these nodes, and I probably will. But then late game, I will respec out of these. So just wanted to put in that little side tangent for any of those that were curious about my thoughts on that. So yeah, anyways, that is the early game plan for PoE2. I'm really excited about Stormweaver. I'll make daily updates to it for those curious, or you can watch and follow on stream if you want to play this build. I will be streaming it all live. And yeah, we'll just see where it goes. I'm really excited about this, but man, can't wait. It's only a couple days away. And then the other ascendancies, I already have a second, third, and maybe even fourth build planned based on some of the things here. I'm really excited about doing a Demoness character. Blood Mage seems fairly interesting for some potential builds. I'm even thinking about a Tri-Stacker with Gemeline Legionnaire. The Invoker Monk, I think, has some pretty good scaling with some, it could make a pretty cool, like, trigger build. So I don't know. There's a lot of things to be excited about. Definitely check out this Ascendancies. Figure out what you like. For me, it's going to be Stormweaver. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care, and peace out. Have a good one.